The paper was still warm from the printer. I hadn't gone looking for it. I'd been searching the home office for our car insurance renewal. Prescott had mentioned it needed signing before the end of the month, and there it was, tucked beneath a manila folder labeled Q3 expenses, as if it were nothing. As if it were a receipt for office supplies or a cable bill. It was a child support modification order. The child's name was Mason, aged 17. Mother listed as a Danielle Cruz of Marietta, Georgia. I stood there in the quiet of that office. The house smelled like the rosemary chicken I'd left warming in the oven, the clock on the wall ticking the way it always did, steady and indifferent, and I read the document 3 times. Then a 4th. The amount was substantial, more than our monthly grocery budget. And in the payment history column, every single month for the past 4 years was marked. Received. At first, I tried to force the discovery into something survivable. One affair. One child. One terrible secret I had somehow missed. But Prescott's finances had never behaved like a man supporting only one hidden life. I knew our accounts too well for that. Over the years there had been strange pressure points in our money. Periodic liquidity problems that appeared and vanished too quickly, unexplained arguments about tax exposure, sudden insistence on restructuring accounts I was never fully shown. I had explained those things away because marriage trains you to smooth rough edges into narratives you can live inside. But sitting in that office with Mason's support order in my hands, the numbers rearranged themselves into something uglier. One child support payment explained some of the missing money. Not all of it. Prescott had been paying child support since years before we adopted Cora. Cora, who was now 14 and asleep down the hall with her headphones on and her geometry textbook open on her lap. Cora, who we adopted because a specialist named Dr. Gerald Muth had sat across from us in a beige office in 2009 and spoken in careful medical language about complications, probabilities, and the need for additional testing. Prescott had squeezed my hand the entire appointment. Later, in the parking garage, he translated uncertainty into certainty. "I just don't want you hurting yourself chasing false hope," he'd said quietly. Over time, I stopped remembering the doctor's exact words. I only remembered my husband's version of them. I set the document back exactly where I found it, smoothed the folder's edge, turned off the office light. Then I went to the kitchen, took the chicken out of the oven, and set the table for 2. Some truths arrive so large you have to let them in slowly, or they'll take the whole house down at once. If you've ever watched someone lose control of a lie they spent years building, stay with me. And if you love intelligent revenge stories, subscribe before we continue. "You're quiet tonight," Prescott said, pouring himself a glass of water. "Tired?" I said. "Long day?" He nodded, already reaching for his phone. That was the thing about Prescott. He never looked too hard at anything that wasn't about him. It was the quality that had made him charming in the beginning, that easy, self-possessed confidence, and the same quality that had, for 15 years, made him careless. "Did you find the insurance form?" he asked without looking up. "Not yet," I said. "I'll look again tomorrow." He made a small sound of acknowledgement and scrolled his screen, and I watched him over the rim of my water glass. I cut my chicken into small, even pieces and said nothing. The worst lies aren't the dramatic ones. They're the ones wrapped so carefully in love that by the time you find the edges, you've already built your entire life around them. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my side of the bed listening to Prescott breathe. Slow, even, unbothered. And I ran the math in my head the way I used to run budget projections at work before I'd cut my hours to be more present at home. For him. For the family he'd designed. Mason was 17. Which meant Prescott had entered our marriage already carrying another family behind him like hidden luggage, holding a 7-month-old baby he'd convinced me was our only path to a family. I got up at 4 a.m., went to the kitchen, and opened my laptop. I was a medical billing specialist for 9 years before I married Prescott. I understood records. I understood how systems worked, what paper trails looked like, and more importantly, how people tried to hide them. Prescott knew I was organized. He had no idea how precise I actually was. I started with what I had: the name Danielle Cruz, Marietta, Georgia. The case number printed on the support order. Within 40 minutes I had her LinkedIn, a Facebook profile set to semi-public, and a boy's photo, a graduation photo from 2 years earlier, grinning with Prescott's exact jawline and eyes. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time. Then I opened it again. I created a new email address that night. A plain one. Nothing identifiable, and I began a folder I labeled simply Insurance. I started reviewing financial records, years of them. Archived tax returns, credit card summaries, quarterly statements from investment accounts I had stopped paying attention to years ago because Prescott preferred handling the long-term planning himself. The first week produced nothing except paranoia. The second produced patterns. Prescott moved money strangely for someone obsessed with efficiency. Transfers in rounded amounts, periodic withdrawals clustered around the same times every year: August, December, May, tuition months, holidays, school registration periods. Once I saw the pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. One child support order explained some of the missing money. Not all of it. By the third week, I stopped looking for evidence of infidelity and started looking for evidence of infrastructure. That's when I found the secondary account. It existed at a regional bank we'd never used jointly. The balance stayed carefully moderate. Never large enough to draw attention, never empty enough to close. But the outgoing transfers told their own story. One recipient appeared repeatedly over 6 years. Brianna Toussaint. No court order, no formal support arrangement, which meant Prescott had worked harder to hide this one. I almost stopped looking after Brianna. Not because I believed there wasn't more. Because for the first time since finding the support order, I became afraid Prescott might realize I was no longer quietly accepting the life he had designed for me. I was watching him too carefully now. And intelligent people notice when observation stops being passive. 3 nights after I found the secondary account, I was sitting in the study reviewing archived statements when I heard Prescott's car pull into the driveway nearly an hour earlier than expected. My body reacted before my mind did. Laptop closed. Papers stacked. Browser history cleared so quickly my hands cramped doing it. By the time he walked into the room, I was standing beside the bookshelf, holding a hardcover novel I hadn't actually been reading. Prescott paused in the doorway. Not suspicious. Evaluating. Working late? He asked. Couldn't sleep. He nodded slowly, but his eyes moved once across the desk before returning to me. I realized then how dangerous the situation actually was. Prescott didn't need proof. Men like him survived on detecting shifts in atmosphere long before evidence appeared. He crossed the room and kissed the side of my head. You know, he said softly, sometimes I think you carry stress like it's a responsibility. There was affection in his voice, which somehow made it worse. After he went upstairs, I sat alone in the dark office listening to the house settle around me. For the first time, I considered walking away from the entire investigation, taking Cora and leaving without learning the rest. But then I looked back at the transfer records spread across the desk, and I realized I wasn't considering stopping because I believed Prescott was innocent. I was considering stopping because continuing meant destroying the last survivable version of my life. That's when I understood how men like Prescott stay protected for so long. Not through brilliance, through exhaustion, through people deciding they would rather live beside uncertainty than fully uncover what waits underneath it. 2 women explained the money. They did not explain Thursdays. For nearly 3 years, Prescott had protected Thursday evenings with unnatural consistency. Client dinners, networking events, industry events that somehow never appeared on firm calendars afterward. Before Mason's support order, before the secondary account, I had never questioned it. Successful men disappear into work all the time. Marriage teaches you not to interrogate every absence if you want peace inside your home. But once I started comparing his schedules against the financial records, something became impossible to ignore. Thursdays were expensive in invisible ways. No restaurant charges, no hotel invoices, no corporate reimbursements, which meant Prescott wasn't expensing those nights. He was containing them. I didn't open the toll records for almost 2 days. They sat in the secure folder my lawyer Sandra had set up for me, untouched, while I moved through the house performing normalcy with increasing precision. Coffee in the mornings, dinner at 6:30, television beside Prescott at night while he answered emails and occasionally touched my knee, like reassurance was still something he believed he was giving me. I kept thinking about stopping, not because I thought Prescott was innocent. That possibility was gone now, but because every answer seemed to erase another version of my life I had once trusted. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from realizing your memories have been edited by someone else. I wasn't sure how many more revisions I could survive. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal anymore. It was the scale. Affairs are chaotic, impulsive, human. What Prescott had built felt organized, intentional. Sometimes late at night, I would look across the room at him and wonder whether I had ever actually been loved at all, or merely managed well enough to remain useful. That question frightened me more than the children did, because children implied secrecy. But management implied design, and design implied that somewhere beneath the marriage I thought I had lived, another structure had existed the entire time. I opened the toll records on a Thursday morning and found Camille. He came downstairs at 7, showered and dressed, and kissed the top of my head the way he always did. "You look tired," he said, pouring coffee. "I didn't sleep well." "You should take something." He said it without turning around. "You've been tense lately." "Probably just the season changing," I said. He nodded, checked his watch, told me he had a dinner Thursday and would be home late. His voice was smooth and practiced, the way it always was when he was managing me rather than talking to me. I had spent years mistaking that smoothness for steadiness. I smiled and told him to have a good day. The moment his car left the driveway, I went back to the office. Sandra subpoenaed additional financial records after I retained her. That's when the toll history surfaced. Every Thursday evening for nearly 3 years, Prescott's transponder crossed the same suburban route 40 minutes outside the city. The exit led toward Belfield. Sandra traced the pattern first. The apartment lease took longer. Prescott's name no longer appeared anywhere on the active lease. But 6 years earlier, before the renewal transfers changed, he'd co-signed the original apartment paperwork. The tenant's name was Camille Reyes. Unlike the others, Camille wasn't hidden through payments. She was hidden through routine. Danielle revealed obligation. Brianna revealed infrastructure. Camille revealed permanence. And me, the woman who couldn't have children. The woman who had grieved that fact in private for a year, before Prescott gently, lovingly suggested adoption. I sat at the kitchen table one night with dates spread across legal pads and realized something that made my stomach turn cold. Prescott had entered our marriage already carrying children, obligations, and entire hidden lives, so why had he worked so hard to convince me we needed to stop trying for one of our own? That was the question that finally broke something open in me. Not whether Prescott had lied, but whether the lie had started much earlier than I ever imagined. I made the appointment with Dr. Patricia the next morning. Not because I suddenly believed I could still become pregnant, but because for the first time in 15 years, I realized I had never heard the full story from anyone except Prescott. Looking back, I realized every conversation about children had always ended the same way, with Prescott comforting me away from hope. At the time, I mistook that for kindness. Years later, I understood it as management. Prescott noticed the appointment 2 days later. I was rinsing dishes when he appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding his tablet loosely at his side. "What's this on Thursday?" he asked casually. I looked over my shoulder. "What? Appointment with Patricia when?" His voice stayed light, but something inside it had tightened by half a degree. I dried my hand slowly. "Just a consultation." About fertility? There it was. Not anger. Precision. Prescott had always spoken carefully when something mattered to him. I shrugged lightly. Routine follow-up. He leaned against the counter, watching me in that calm, attentive way I had once mistaken for safety. "Olive," he said gently, "we already went through all of this." I said nothing. He stepped closer. "I just don't want you reopening something painful unnecessarily." There was kindness in his voice. Practiced kindness, the kind designed to make resistance feel unreasonable. 15 years earlier, it would have worked immediately. Now all I heard was direction. "Dr. Muth was very thorough," he continued quietly. "You remember that?" I turned off the faucet. "I remember being upset," I said. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes. Not fear exactly. Calculation under pressure. "Olive," he smiled softly, "what are you looking for here?" It was such a careful question, not, "Why are you doing this?" but, "What do you already know?" I realized then that Prescott wasn't worried about the appointment itself. He was worried about losing ownership of the narrative. I picked up my glass of water and met his eyes. "Maybe I just want to hear it from someone else this time." Silence. The kitchen suddenly felt very small. Prescott recovered first. He always had. He smiled again, warm, patient, almost amused. "Of course," he said softly, "if that's what you need." But that night, for the first time in 15 years, Prescott stayed awake after I pretended to fall asleep. I could feel him beside me in the dark, thinking. Dr. Wen called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store. "Olive," she said, "I want to go over your results in person, but I want you to be prepared. Everything looks completely normal. Your uterine environment is healthy. Your hormone panels are excellent for your age. There's no physiological reason you couldn't have carried a pregnancy." I already knew what she was going to say. I'd suspected it for weeks. Long enough for the answer to stop feeling shocking and start feeling inevitable. But hearing it said out loud, plainly, by a doctor I trusted, that was different. I thanked her. Scheduled the follow-up. Sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes, watching people push carts to their cars and load groceries into trunks and live their ordinary lives. Then I called Sandra. She had initially been recommended by a colleague I trusted absolutely. I met her that afternoon while Prescott was at his conveniently timed dinner. I brought a folder. Inside, the child support order, the photographed bank statements, the secondary account transfers, the names, approximate ages, and documented physical resemblances of 3 children, the medical results from Dr. Wen, a timeline I had constructed methodically over the past 6 weeks. Sandra looked through everything without expression. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me. "How long have you been married?" 15 years. "And the adoption, was it his suggestion?" "Entirely." She wrote something on her notepad. "Did he select the original fertility specialist?" "He researched several and recommended Dr. Muth specifically." She nodded slowly. "Olive, I want to say something carefully. What you're describing, if it holds up, isn't just infidelity. It's sustained, deliberate fraud. Against you, against your reproductive autonomy, against your ability to make informed decisions about your own life." I had known that. I had sat with that knowledge every night for 6 weeks. but hearing it named so cleanly by a professional made my hands steady in a way they hadn't been in a long time. "What do I need?" I asked. "More," she said. "But what you have is a very strong beginning. I need to tell you about Cora." My daughter had Prescott's schedule memorized better than I did. She knew when he was distracted, when he was performing, when his charm was genuine versus deployed. She was 14 and sharper than anyone in that house gave her credit for, including me, until she knocked on my bedroom door on a Saturday morning and sat cross-legged on my bed and said, without preamble, "Mom, what's going on with you?" I looked at her for a long moment. She had warm brown eyes and a serious face and the particular stillness of a person who listens before they speak. Nothing about her looked like Prescott. Everything about her felt like mine. "I'm handling something," I said carefully. "Does it have to do with why you've been sleeping weird and why you made a new email account on the kitchen laptop and didn't clear the browser history?" I stared at her. She shrugged. "I do the IT stuff around here. You know that." She was 14. She was also apparently 3 steps ahead of both of us. I made a decision in that moment that I have never regretted. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. I told her that I had discovered her father had not been honest with me, with us, for a very long time. That I was being careful and strategic, and that I needed her to behave completely normally around him until I said otherwise. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. She pulled her knees to her chest and thought for a moment. "How can I help?" she asked. That was my daughter. "You've been different lately," Prescott said that evening. We were watching television, or he was watching it, and I was present in the room, which he had always mistaken for the same thing. "In what way?" "Calmer." He glanced at me. "It's nice, actually. You seem settled." "I feel settled," I said. He smiled and turned back to the screen, satisfied with the answer he'd interpreted rather than the one I'd given. Silence, I had learned, was the most precise instrument I owned. He always filled it with whatever he needed to believe. After Dr. Wen's results, I stopped thinking about infertility as a tragedy and started thinking about it as a timeline. Prescott had entered our marriage already carrying children, financial obligations, and carefully compartmentalized lives. He had discouraged additional testing almost immediately. Redirected every conversation about biological children toward grief instead of possibility. Suggested adoption with the calm certainty of someone presenting a solution he had already emotionally prepared for. And once I started looking at the sequence of events instead of the emotions surrounding them, one possibility kept surfacing, no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it. What if Prescott had never intended to have children with me at all? The thought felt too deliberate, too cruel, which was probably why I couldn't let it go. I didn't ask Cora to search for a vasectomy specifically. I only told her I believed there was a medical decision Prescott had made before our marriage that he had never disclosed. She listened without interrupting, asked a few questions about dates, and disappeared into her room with a notebook. Cora had spent her whole life watching Prescott manage information inside our house. Once she understood what she was looking for, she approached the problem the same way he would have, systematically. 4 days later, she walked into the kitchen carrying 3 pages of handwritten notes. "Mom," she said carefully. I looked up from my coffee. "Every timeline points to the same thing." She spread the papers across the table. Birth dates, support payments, our wedding date, the fertility consultations, the adoption paperwork, everything arranged in neat columns. "He already had children before you got married." I nodded. "He didn't want more." I said nothing, and he stopped the testing almost immediately. For a long moment she studied the dates. Then she looked up. "What if Dad already solved the problem before he married you?" The words landed harder than I expected. Not because they were shocking, Because they weren't. Because somewhere over the previous 6 weeks, I had begun arriving at the same conclusion without allowing myself to say it out loud. I mentioned the possibility to Sandra during our next meeting. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't look surprised. She simply opened a legal pad and wrote something down. "If that's what happened," she said quietly, "there will be a record." The vasectomy surfaced during discovery 3 weeks later. Performed in 2007, 2 years before our wedding. Elective, successful, documented cleanly. He had known before he ever married me that he never intended to have biological children inside our marriage. He had made certain of it. And then he had watched me mourn that impossibility for a year and done nothing except guide me gently toward the solution he had already decided on. A family that looked complete from the outside. An adoption he never had to explain, and a wife contained enough by grief to stop asking questions. I added the record to Sandra's folder. Then I took Cora to lunch and let her order whatever she wanted and told her she was the most extraordinary person I had ever known. She looked at me seriously over her burger and said, "What's the plan?" I told her we were almost ready. The third woman's full name was Camille Reyes. Sandra found her through the secondary account's wire transfer history. Camille lived 40 minutes away, close enough that I understood immediately why Prescott had been so consistent about his Thursday dinners for the past 3 years. Her daughter's name was Sophia. She was 24 years old. Sandra reached out through proper legal channels. She was measured, professional, and precise. She did not tell Camille who she was representing at first, only that she was investigating a matter involving a man named Prescott Hale, and that Camille might have relevant information. Camille called Sandra back within 2 hours. She and Prescott hadn't been romantically involved for years, not since Sophia was born, according to Sandra. But he remained financially entangled in their lives, in ways that made distance difficult. Camille already had a folder of her own, 6 years of records. Lease renewals. Prescott had quietly guaranteed through intermediary accounts. Messages sent minutes apart to different women using nearly identical language. Screenshots of promises he never intended to keep, but repeated often enough to maintain loyalty. Calendars. Travel overlaps. Photos timestamped during weekends. Prescott had told me he was attending conferences. But the most useful material wasn't romantic. It was procedural. Camille had spent years documenting inconsistencies because somewhere deep down, she had always suspected she was being managed rather than loved. She had records of Prescott changing stories depending on who was asking questions. Financial explanations that shifted month to month, carefully timed disappearances. Excuses reused often enough to become recognizable. Danielle proved Prescott had obligations. Brianna proved he had systems. Camille proved the deception was intentional. Her evidence mattered because it showed Prescott's lies weren't impulsive. They were architectural. Sandra told her what legal protections existed for her and her daughter. Camille went quiet for a moment on the phone. Then she said, "What do you need from me?" I wasn't on that call. Sandra briefed me afterward, but when she told me what Camille had said, I felt something shift. Not triumph, not yet, but a specific weight lifting. The isolation of knowing something enormous and unknowable alone. Danielle in Marietta, Brianna in Charlotte, Camille 40 minutes away. 3 women who had each in their own way been managed, contained, kept separate so that none of us could ever see the full picture. Now we could. "You seem happy," Prescott said one morning over coffee. "I am," I said. He watched me for a moment, something uncertain moving beneath his expression. He had been watching me more carefully lately. I could feel it, the subtle recalibration of a man who sensed that something in his environment had changed but couldn't locate what. "Are you seeing someone?" he asked. He said it lightly, almost as a joke. I looked at him steadily. "A therapist?" A beat. "Sure, a therapist." Yes, I said. I found it very clarifying. He nodded slowly and returned to his coffee. But I watched his jaw tighten by a degree that he didn't know I noticed. That was the first time I saw fear on Prescott Hale's face. It looked exactly like control. Prescott's firm held its annual client appreciation dinner every November at the Hargrove Hotel downtown, a tiered ballroom event with a guest list of 60, a catered 3-course meal, and a brief remarks segment where the partners spoke about the year. Prescott had attended every year for 11 years. He had introduced me to clients there, called me his anchor in toasts, used our marriage as evidence of the stability and integrity he sold professionally. This year, Sandra and I agreed it was the right setting. Not for a scene. Not for a confrontation. For a delivery. The week before the dinner, Sandra filed divorce petition, fraud claim, request for full financial disclosure. Prescott was served on a Tuesday afternoon at his office, which Sandra had timed deliberately. Enough time for him to absorb it, not enough time to fully strategize before the event. He came home that evening, like a man walking through glass. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was controlled, but the edges were wrong. "Okay," I said. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I didn't stand up. He sat across from me, set the papers on the table between us like a challenge. "This is extreme, Olive. Whatever you think you know." "I know about Mason," I said quietly, "and Elijah, and Sophia." The color left his face in a single, complete motion. "I know about the vasectomy, Prescott. I know about Dr. Muth. I know about the secondary account and the Charlotte transfers and the apartment on Belfield that Camille's been living in." Silence. "I know all of it," I said. "I've known for months." He opened his mouth, closed it. I watched him cycle through 3 or 4 responses before he found the one he thought might work. "Olive." His voice dropped to that gentle register. "I know how this looks, but there are things you don't understand." I said nothing. When I had the vasectomy, I already had children. More responsibility than I knew how to manage. More complications than I wanted to bring into another life. His eyes stayed fixed on mine. I wasn't planning to get married. I wasn't planning to start over. The room felt very still. "Then I met you." I almost laughed. "You have a strange way of showing it." Something tightened in his face. "You wanted children more than anything." I knew that. Every time we talked about the future, I knew it. He looked away briefly. "At first I told myself I'd tell you. Then it became harder." His voice was quieter now. "Then we went to see Dr. Muth." Neither of us spoke. The day we left that office, you cried the entire drive home. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely tired. I remember pulling into the garage and sitting there while you tried to pull yourself together. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I should have told you then. The words hung between us. That was the moment. His jaw tightened. Everything after that became easier. Not easier to live with. Not easier to justify. Just easier to continue. I told myself I was protecting you. Then I told myself I was protecting us. Then enough years passed that I stopped separating the two. Silence. I thought adoption would give you what you wanted. I thought we could build a good life and leave the rest buried. Buried? I repeated. I was trying to protect what we had. No. My voice was calm, steady. You were protecting what you wanted. His eyes closed briefly. Not disagreement, recognition. The difference matters, Prescott. The room was silent for several seconds. Then I leaned forward slightly. Do you know what the worst part is? He didn't answer. I could have forgiven the vasectomy. His head lifted. I could have forgiven the fear, the bad timing, even the lie at the beginning. I held his gaze. What I can't forgive is that you watched me grieve for years. The words landed harder than anything else I'd said. You watched me blame my body. His face changed. You watched me sit in waiting rooms and cry in parking lots and wonder what was wrong with me. He said nothing. And every single time, you already knew. Silence. heavy, absolute. "I loved you," he said quietly. I believed him. That was the tragedy. Not that he was lying now, but that somewhere inside all of it, he probably thought that had always been enough. It wasn't. It never was. He stared at me across the table, and I watched him realize for the first time that the woman he had managed for 15 years had stopped being manageable somewhere along the way without him ever noticing. "The dinner is Friday," I said, standing and picking up my tea. "I'll be attending." He tried 3 times to convince me not to come. The first attempt happened the next morning over coffee. "Olive," he said carefully, "Friday doesn't need to become something bigger than it already is." I looked up from my toast. "I'm attending my husband's work dinner." "Given the circumstances." "The circumstances you created?" Silence. Prescott adjusted immediately. He always adjusted quickly. "I'm thinking about Cora," he said softly. "About protecting her from unnecessary fallout." There it was. Not denial. Redirection. I almost admired how instinctive it was for him. "Interesting," I said calmly. "You've spent 15 years making unilateral decisions for this family, and suddenly you're collaborative." His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Olive, please don't do this publicly." "Publicly. Not, don't hurt me. Not, I'm sorry. Publicly. Reputation first. Always." "You seem confused about something," I said quietly. "I'm not creating the humiliation, Prescott. I'm just refusing to continue absorbing it privately." He stared at me for a long moment, and for the first time since I had known him, I watched Prescott encounter a situation he could neither charm nor organize into submission. The second attempt came through logistics. He mentioned weather, parking downtown, long evenings being difficult for Cora, Sandra's influence, the stress of public environments while emotions were high. Each concern arrived packaged as care. Each one was really containment. By the third attempt, he stopped pretending. "You know what this could do to me professionally," he said quietly the night before the dinner. I folded a sweater into my overnight bag without looking up. "Yes," I said. The room went still. Prescott inhaled slowly. 15 years, Olive." I looked at him then. Really looked at him. At the man who had spent a decade and a half controlling information so carefully he mistook management for love. "Exactly," I said. I wore a navy dress to the Hargrove dinner. Cora helped me pick it. She had strong opinions about color and said navy read as composed, not sad. She was right. I arrived with Sandra, who attended as my guest. Prescott had called me twice that week, trying to reach a private agreement before the evening. I hadn't answered. He had texted carefully worded messages about discretion and the well-being of the family. I had forwarded them all to Sandra and said nothing back. When Prescott saw me walk into the ballroom, something moved across his face that I recognized now as the specific panic of a man whose architecture was collapsing inward while the exterior still had to hold. He crossed the room toward me. His smile was perfect. "You look beautiful," he said, and I understood it as a negotiation. "Thank you," I said pleasantly. He leaned slightly closer. "Olive, whatever you're thinking, not here, please. These are my clients." "I'm not going to make a scene, Prescott." I met his eyes. "I'm just attending my husband's work dinner, like I have for 11 years. He searched my face for something to hold on to. He didn't find it. What he found 20 minutes later was Danielle Cruz standing near the bar. She had driven from Marietta. Sandra had spoken with her the previous week, not to recruit her for a confrontation, but to ensure she understood what was being filed and what her son was now legally entitled to. She had decided on her own to come. I hadn't asked her. I wouldn't have. But I wasn't going to ask her to leave either. Prescott saw her from across the room. I watched the recognition hit him like a physical thing. Then he saw Camille near the entrance. Something inside Prescott visibly failed. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to understand. It happened in fragments. His posture lost its precision first. shoulders loosening by degrees as if his body had suddenly become too heavy to organize correctly. Then his eyes. Prescott had spent 15 years looking directly at people, steadily enough to make them feel managed before they ever realized they were being handled. Now his gaze kept breaking away and snapping back again, recalculating faster than he could stabilize. He looked toward the ballroom doors, toward Danielle, toward Camille, toward the partners gathering near the stage. I watched him understand, piece by piece, that the separation between his lives no longer existed. And for the first time since I had known him, Prescott Hale looked like a man encountering consequences faster than he could contain them. He turned back to me, and for the first time in 15 years, Prescott Hale had no prepared response. "You should know," I said quietly, "that Mason and Elijah and Sophia are all going to be fine. Sandra has made sure of that legally. That was always the priority." His mouth opened, but no version of himself arrived to save him this time. "The partners received copies of the financial disclosure filings this afternoon," I continued. "Not from me. That's public record once filed. Sandra simply ensured they were aware, given the firm's client trust accounts being named in the discovery request." "I'm going to get a drink," I said. "Enjoy your evening." I found Cora in the lobby at 9:30. She had come with my sister, who had sat with her in the hotel cafe while I was inside. Cora stood up when she saw me, reading my face the way she always had, with that quiet precision that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the 14 years we'd spent in the same rooms learning each other. "Done?" she asked. "Done," I said. She nodded once, satisfied, and handed me my coat. The divorce took 8 months. Prescott hired 2 lawyers and tried 4 different approaches, all of which Sandra had anticipated. The fraud filing was the anchor, the vasectomy record, cross-referenced with clinic records, and the fertility diagnosis that Sandra's expert described as inconsistent with my actual medical profile, gave the court a documented pattern of deliberate deception spanning the entirety of our marriage. He settled. He had to. The house went to me and Cora. The financial disclosure revealed 3 additional accounts Sandra hadn't yet found. The settlement reached into all of them. Danielle and Brianna and Camille each had independent counsel by that point, all 3 of them filing separate actions that would follow Prescott well past the end of our marriage. I heard from Sandra that he'd been placed on administrative leave at the firm, pending their own internal review. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected at that news. I felt something quieter, more final. On the first Saturday after the divorce was finalized, Cora and I drove to the coast. It was early November, cold and clear, and we walked on a beach that was almost empty and didn't talk much. She was bundled in an oversized jacket and had her hair pulled back, and she walked with her hands in her pockets, looking at the water with that serious, that watchful expression that had been hers since she was 7 months old. "Are you okay?" she asked eventually. "Yes," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant it in years. "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "Mason and Elijah and Sophia." She said the names carefully, like she'd been holding them for a while. "They didn't do anything." "No." Agreed. "They didn't. I'm not saying we have to do anything about it. I just think about them sometimes." I looked at her. This person who had come into my life because a man had engineered a lie and had become the most true thing in it. "Me too," I said. We walked for another hour without needing to say much else. The water was gray and cold, and the wind came off it steadily, and I thought about 15 years of mornings in a house where I had believed certain things about myself and my body and my marriage that had all been constructed for someone else's convenience. I thought about how grief, when it's manufactured by someone who profits from it, is a particular kind of theft. He had stolen something from me that I could never fully calculate. But he hadn't taken Cora. He'd handed her to me, thinking she was a prop in his life, and she had turned out to be the realest thing I'd ever been given. Some men are undone by their enemies. Prescott was undone by the family he never took seriously enough to fear. On the drive home, Cora fell asleep in the passenger seat with her jacket bunched under her head and her mouth slightly open, the way she'd slept since she was small. I drove and let her rest. The road was quiet. The sky had gone the deep, specific blue of late afternoon in November, that color that always feels like the day deciding to be honest about what it is. I had spent 15 years being convinced I was less than I was. I had no interest in spending the next 15 the same way. That was enough. That was everything. I spent 15 years grieving children I was never actually denied, only redirected away from. If you enjoy stories where the truth wins, the lies collapse, and the people who thought they were untouchable finally face consequences, don't forget to like and subscribe.